This was a story that got lots of China watchers very excited this week. It's from the South China Morning Post, and it reads, China removes hukou hurdle for migrant workers in social insurance shakeup. Now, that might sound like a very technical story, esoteric even, but the hukou system is one of the most important policies enforced by the Chinese Communist Party. It's been in place since the late 1950s and affects hundreds of millions of people. People have been calling to get rid of it for decades, and now it looks finally set to end, potentially. So what is the hukou system? Well, a hukou is a household registration document, which everyone in China has to have. And that's the front of the booklet there. Like a passport or any other ID card, it has your name, your date of birth, a few other identifying details. The key bit, though, is this. The real importance of the hukou and why it's different to other national ID cards is that it defines you based on where you were born within China. So any individual will be recorded as either rural or urban based on where they come from, as well as their city or province of origin. And what's crucial about this is that your classification determines what kind of social benefits like healthcare, schooling, or pensions you are entitled to receive. Since it was introduced in 1958, the hukou system has granted much more generous social rights to Chinese citizens with an urban hukou, as opposed to ones with a rural hukou. So you're massively advantaged, basically, if you get the urban one compared to the rural one. Now, that's led it to be criticised as a form of social apartheid. This is part of a documentary from ABC Australia on the hukou system.
You are not a local citizen. You cannot have access to good quality public school for your children. Your child cannot take national exam. You cannot have access to social housing. It is difficult for you to get full pension coverage as well. I think hukou policy in a nutshell is discriminatory and it's inefficient.
Until recently, rural hukou holders weren't even allowed to move freely outside their hometowns. It was only in 2003 that the Chinese government abolished the policy that allowed local authorities to arrest and evict migrant workers in the cities. But many rural families, like Lin's, still choose to relocate to cities for better opportunities, even though they aren't entitled to the same benefits as their peers.
We were moving houses every year. We moved at least 20 times since we came to Shanghai more than 20 years ago.
So why did China introduce such a discriminatory system? After all, the People's Republic of China was the creation of a peasant revolution. So why did rural people end up as second-class citizens? Well, under Mao, the idea was to keep more people in the countryside to help feed the country's urban population, which he thought would hopefully lead to industrialization. Now, Mao's agricultural policies were completely disastrous, led to the deaths of millions of people. If you had a rural hukou as well, that meant that you couldn't go to urban areas where people got a food ration. In the countryside, you're expected to get it from your own land. However, that was being confiscated. Very bad. In the reform period under Deng Xiaoping, the hukou system played a different role. So for critics on the left, the hukou under Deng was a system which enabled the fast-growing manufacturing industries to better exploit migrant workers from the countryside. The logic is this: if your workers don't have social rights, they are cheaper to employ. So it's a little bit like when people say, businesses like to have precarious immigrant labor because they're easier to exploit. The same argument can be made there. However, those more sympathetic to Deng see the hukou system as a policy which enabled China to quickly develop its economy without the creation of large-scale slums. So the logic here is fairly simple. If you have a country of over 1 billion people, you might not want everyone to rush into the few leading cities, say Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen. And so the hukou system provided the government with a means to manage urbanization in a more functional way. So you don't get sort of the same slums you got to India or Mexico's major cities. This latter analysis was shared by the World Bank, who in a 2008 report said this: one of China's greatest successes in its rapid urbanization has been that it has managed to contain the process to the extent that there are crowded living conditions but very few slums. This is an important achievement for a developing country, and they credited the hukou system with that achievement. That's the background. Bringing us back to this week's news. What about this system has changed? Well, this is a report from Channel News Asia on the announcement made by the Chinese State Council last week. So they write, this. The guidelines called for the complete elimination, so this is the new guidelines from the Chinese government, for the complete elimination of household registration restrictions on migrants' participation in employee social insurance. Their access to basic medical security in their place of residence should be strengthened, the statement added. The guidelines also proposed improving educational guarantees for migrant children, including increasing the proportion of them attending public schools during the compulsory education stage. It says promoting equal access to basic public services for non-registered permanent residents and registered residents is conducive to meeting the people's growing needs for a better life and releasing domestic demand potential, the State Council said. So the article sort of goes on to say that this is sort of hopefully, according to the Chinese government, going to be able to increase consumption in the economy, because if more people have social rights, more access to pensions, to welfare benefits, they're going to have to save a bit less. Or they won't have to save quite as much, and then they can spend money in the economy. Also important to note, I mean, this has been a huge sort of debate on Twitter. Lots of people saying this isn't as black and white as you think. It's not that there was a hukou system until last Friday and now it's gone. This has been loosening for a while. I think lots of the sort of mid-sized cities have loosened it for a long time because they actually have a labor shortage, so they want more people in. But Beijing, Shanghai, all the big cities still have it quite strict because otherwise shed loads of people want to go there. Aaron, lots of people saying this is by far the most important news in the world this month because it affects hundreds of millions of people in a very fundamental way and tells us something significant about Chinese development. What's your take?
Michael, I want your take. You're the Novara China guy. You know, I saw the way when you were talking about Mao and his agricultural policies, you pursed your lips.
Yeah, you think I'm too harsh on
you
Mao.
You got angry, and then you said,
Deng.
but of course the enlightened Deng Xiaoping, and you sort of...
then I perk up.
Your shoulders were broader. I could see you breathing out a bit happier, your cheeks were rosier. So maybe you talk about it.
Well, I mean, I think this is interesting. I mean, I suppose what I find very interesting is the two ways that this is talked about, right? So Chinese leftists as well, and especially sort of Chinese Trotskyists, their position is that this was a form of internal colonization where you have a hukou system to enable the hyper-exploitation of the rural population. And it's all framed in a very negative light. Sort of Chinese leftists often don't really like Deng Xiaoping because they think that he brought too much capitalism to China and enabled the exploitation of workers. Now, people who are more in favor of reform and opening and more in favor of Deng, they say, as I explained there, that this was necessary for development. And I think partly the way to understand that is that China isn't, I mean, it is a country, but it's also a continent. So when people sort of say, how can this country have internal restrictions on where people can move? And how can you have different rights based on where you were born? It's a bit like saying, in the whole of Europe at the beginning of development, if anyone in Europe could move anywhere and get any kind of benefits, it would be difficult to build up benefits in Britain if anyone could come there and get them immediately. And it's kind of similar to that. I mean, it does seem very harsh because, especially for young people, and I think the darker part of it is that it seems like they wanted working age people to come to the cities to work in the factories or wherever, or the outskirts of cities. But they quite wanted their kids to stay home with their grandparents. And so the kids would go to school in the countryside and get looked after by their grandparents. And then the parents would come to the mid-sized cities and work very long hours without caring responsibilities. And, combine that with the one-child policy, and that seems quite harsh both on the parents and the kids. Even though, I can see why, if you want to have super fast development without slums, then some kind of restrictions on movement are going to be necessary. That's my take.
My take is that lots of people in the West and in Britain will look at the hukou system and go, this is outrageous. It's appalling. We have exactly the same system in some respects. So if you look at, for instance, the NHS, hugely dependent on importing nurses, doctors, all kinds of labor from overseas, skilled labor. And we're basically making other places internalize those costs. So the hukou system is similar in so much as the costs of raising those kids and the costs of looking after those kids once they return back to where they're from when they're elderly, the social reproduction, the social labor, other people can pay for that. But when they're working age and they can make a nice profit for for a nice capitalist in urban China, let's have them. And this is talked about at length by Rosa Luxemburg. In terms of capitalism and exploitation, it's not just the wage-labor relation where a worker is exploited by a capitalist and some value is skimmed off and that's profit. That's one relation. but she talks about others too. So you have that's a wheel that's turning. Capital is value in motion. What's capital? Money that makes money. It's a wheel that's turning. And then at the same time, you have another wheel that's turning, which is the social reproduction, which allows this other wheel to turn, right? Which is primarily women, but families raising kids and looking after old people. So that wheel, which we never even talk about, allows this bigger wheel to turn. And then, of course, another one is colonialism, where you get cheap resources from places like the DRC or wherever, cheap food, cheap energy, and that allows this wheel to turn as well. So we think of capitalism as wage and labor, capital and labor, boss and worker, but there are these two other circles too, which make that even plausible. One of them is that wheel of social reproduction. So Hukou is actually just an overt, explicit admission of how capitalist systems often work. And I think actually, if you look at the NHS, it's just basically the same thing. You know, or you can, and actually it's being even more overt now with people like Restore, because they'll probably say, you know what, you can come here as a nurse from Nigeria for 5 years, but you can't claim any benefits at all. If you get sick, you can't get any benefits. You can't get any form of safety net. I imagine at some point they'll probably start saying that these people can't get minimum wage either.
And don't bring your kids.
And don't bring your kids. You're just here to work, just here to help us make profit. And the costs of your training, they can be internalized by the Congolese, the Nigerian taxpayer. And the costs of you being raised can be internalized by your parents. And the costs of looking after you when you're old, well, they can be internalized by your children. So it's outsourcing the costs to other places. So it's a very universal phenomenon. But as you said at the start of the story, this is one of the big global stories of this month, but also of Chinese capitalism over the last 40 years. It's a huge shift. But it's like I say, it's not like it came from nowhere. It's been a transition. But I think to declare it shifting like this is a big moment.
What do you think about the framing, though? I suppose because you're bringing in Rosa Luxemburg, you've got the kind of Chinese leftist sort of idea of this was internal colonization, this was hyper-exploitation, and then you've got the sort of more generous view of Deng as sort of a pragmatist, whereby, it wasn't necessarily like the most fair system, but it was the system that brought China out of poverty. I don't know where you sort of fall.
I mean, you don't need to call it hyper-exploitation. It was exploitative. Capitalism is exploitative. Markets are often exploitative. And I suppose the Dengist argument, and I don't know what Deng said about Hukou, but he would have said that
he kept it in place.
Yeah, this is a necessary prerequisite to develop the means of production and to unleash the forces of production. And of course, it's happened at the same time that they've eliminated rural poverty. So I think it's part of a broader policy mix, which clearly has left China in a better place today than it was 45 years ago. But it was a very exploitative policy, yeah. But so were the 5-year plans. Loads of bad stuff happened. But I think if you look at certain outcomes, okay, well, the Soviet Union ends up in a better place after that than it does before. I'm not talking about the forced labor camps building, canals or whatnot. I'm talking about steel production and so on. There was hyper-exploitation of workers in certain industries to get production up. And often that was accompanied actually by the workers themselves wanting to be exploited with things like Stakhanovism. And which was a grassroots, bottom-up social movement to contribute to revolutionary progress coming from the workers, which was saying, we'll be more exploited than we'd like to be perhaps for a little while to help develop the means of production. Similar thing going on here.
I suppose growth in China was so fast as well that it was, I suppose the Industrial Revolution in Britain, we kind of all benefited from it, but there was a generation or two who got really screwed.
A few more than that, right?
In China, it's the people getting screwed are the same people who get to benefit from it 20 or 30 years later.
Well, if you look at the Engels pause, you've got basically between 1790 and the 1860s, 70s, you basically have flatlining or stagnating living standards for working people.
For how many years was that?
Well, at least half a century, I think. At least half a century. I mean, people actually said Napoleon Wars, the 1860s, but I think you go back further. That's not the case in China.
Let's wrap up there. Very interesting way to end the show. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.